Hello, parents. Nice to see you.
I'm going to hide myself for most of the call, but I'm here.
Nice to see you.
You too.
It makes it better when I'm having internet problems. If I take my video off, it makes it loads better. Yeah.
If you take your video off, we want to see you if you're presenting them.
Yeah, no, this is why I was just saying I've wheeled my desk into the living room so I can hardwire myself to the router. But I'm not sat with my laptop on my lap.
Well, I'm going to switch off my browser. You think I'd learn, wouldn't you? Let's get rid of that. A minute or so before we start. Is somebody able to start the YouTube?
It's started.
Great.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
There is going to be some audience participation in this.
Oh.
So you might find it easier if you've got a phone or a tablet sort of next to you. Might be a bit easier than using your browser, but there is a way to do it.
Are we ready to start? Will we give a few more minutes?
Whatever you think, Barbara.
Well, there's people still coming in, but I think we probably should start. The live streaming has begun. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you, whether you're on Zoom or on YouTube, to our very second research forum seminar to be delivered online this term. And really delighted that Dr. Jennie Henley is our speaker today. Jennie started at the RNCM as Director of Programs in October, November, so a very recent new colleague, and it's fantastic to have her here. Her research area, her expertise in music education and in the issues of inclusivity are really at the heart of what we do at the RNCM, and a really vital area for us. Jennie has a great reputation as a researcher, and came to us from the Royal College of Music, and it's also been attached to other institutions as well before that. She's published widely with recent publications, the International Journal of Community Music, Music Education Research, and Inclusive Pedagogy across the curriculum. The issues of inclusivity in education and music education, particularly in the conservatoire context, are really, really important issues of top priority for us on a national level. Today she's going to be talking about her AHRC network grant about MUSOC, the project MUSOC, and the title of her talk is Redefining Excellence and Inclusion. And before I hand over to her, if I can encourage you to keep your microphones off unless you are speaking when we come to the questions. And when we come to question time, to use the blue raise hand symbol, which you can find in the managed participants. We also have mentee, and Jenny will explain how that's going to work, but it means that we can get the participation of our colleagues and friends who are following us on YouTube. I'd also suggest that you close down any excess browsers. Last week, we began our research seminar with a fascinating loop composition, which was not at all intended. So I've certainly done that. And if you want to follow suit, that would be great. So please, let's welcome Jennie Henley.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Rapturous silent round of applause. That's lovely. Great. I'm just going to share my screen here. Just bear with me. There we go. Lovely. I'm really delighted to be here in the comfort of my own living room speaking to you today. I do need to just give you a little bit of a warning. First of all, my son has his trombone lesson at 5 o'clock. So at 5 o'clock you might hear some really interesting, beautiful trombone sounds coming from the distance. So what I'm going to do over the next 25 minutes or so is give you an overview of the AHRC funded research network project MUSOC. I'm going to explain what it is, why we set it up, what we did, and then I'm going to share some of the main discourses and discussions that arose in the project to give you a little taster of some of the discussion that led us to our findings, and then I'm going to end with a beginning. So last week David Horn gave a world premiere of a piece of music that might never be. So this week I'm going to give you a world premiere, because this is the first time the findings have been revealed. A world premiere of an ending that's actually really a beginning. So a really important part of the MUSOC project was engaging as many voices from practitioners, researchers as possible. And to do that, we used interactive presentation, Mentee, and you can see this on the screen now. So what you can do is, if you go to mentee.com and you put the code in 605514, then you should see this presentation on your screen. So you could probably use a tablet or a phone to do it, or if you haven't, I believe if you press escape, it will take you out of the it will take you out of the shared screen. So when you interact, one person has given me a little heart there, and somebody's given me a question mark. There's a cat for some reason, I'm not really sure why, but I've always include it because I think it's quite good fun. So when you participate, when you interact, you'll see these things coming up on the screen. So what I'm going to do to start with is I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. And the first thing I'm going to ask you is to just give a few words to describe your practice. So hopefully I should be able to move on. There we go. Give a couple of words to describe your practice. So if you use the Mentee, you should have a little thing come up saying presenter has moved on, and if you click that, it will take you to this slide. So we asked everybody this at the beginning of our all of our events, because we wanted to know who we were talking to, who was in the room and where they were coming from. So obviously nobody's in the room because nobody's put anything yet. But just while you're doing that, so as Barbara explained, my research is concerned with the relationship between pedagogy and inclusion, and this really was my driver for this project. I've worked in quite a wide range of different places. I can see already that there's a whole range of different people working in different fields, I've also studied quite a lot of different educational contexts, and on the surface these look quite disparate. They look quite, you know, the connection between them isn't all that clear, but what really does connect them is the relationship between pedagogy, musical learning processes, how musical learning is fostered, and inclusion, which tends to be the intended, you know, the intention of the context. Lovely. So whole range of people, sound engineer, composer, community music practitioner, lovely. And hopefully we've got people who, if you're watching via YouTube, this is how you can participate here as well. Great. So the next question is, I'm interested in what you think inclusion is. So what is inclusion? Don't think too hard about it. Just pop in what comes into your mind at this very particular moment in time. So inclusion has been a factor in most of the contexts I've worked in. But it ranges from inclusion meaning everybody doing the same thing, and quite often that's the way we think about it. But actually inclusion can also mean everybody doing something completely different. So making sure anyone who wants to participate can, under 18 teaching. Not as many responses here. Perhaps you're all waiting to decide what I'm going to say before putting it. Not exclusion, opportunities for all, access. Wonderful. So these are very similar to the sort of things, descriptions that we had come through our project. Abilities, everybody can be involved, equal access, lovely. So the next question, this is the last question I'm going to ask you for the time being, is I want to know what you think excellence means. So if this is inclusion, equal access, opportunities, making sure everybody can be involved, what do we think excellence is? So we work within an environment that prides itself on the fact that everybody within this context achieves excellence in everything that they do. And of course, we all do really, really different things. So I'm interested to know what you think excellence is. Doing well, wonderful. Who's going to be next? This is much easier to do when you're with a live crowd, I can tell you. Being as good at something as you can be, lovely. Originality, Wayne's World, interesting. I should say that we've got a profanity filter on this, so if you do put a rude word on it, it won't be shown. Working to a highest level possible, peak performance, doing what you're doing, attain your potential, great, lovely. So what I want you to do as I'm going through this is I want you to keep these definitions in mind. I want you to particularly think about the relationship between how you described your practice, what it is you do, and how you defined inclusion and excellence. And I also want you to think whether, if I'd have asked you these questions in a different order, whether you would have said something different or not. Great. So I'm just going to move here. Okay. So there's nothing to look at for a little while, but I've just put the website up of where all the MUSOC materials are. So feel free, if you want to have a browse through that while I'm talking, please do so. So MUSOC, so my research partner on this project was Professor Lee, or is Professor Lee Higgins from York St John University. So Lee and I met at the International Society for Music Education World Music Education Conference in Brazil in 2014. We met at the Community Music Activity Seminar, and I identify as a music educator who crosses over into community music. So my background's in teaching, but I work with people who've previously been excluded from music in some way or other. Lee identifies as Lee is a community musician, and if you're not familiar with community music in the UK, it has its roots in the community arts movement and is closely aligned with social activism. So rather than being just music that simply happens to be in a community environment or community setting, it has a proactive agenda that is quite often related to balancing the inequalities of both music and society. So as an educator, I would say that that's the purpose of all education. But a community musician who's had a different experience of education would probably argue that education is the causer of the inequalities of both music and society. So Lee and I had some really interesting and engaging discussions. We met at various different conferences, and one of the things we noticed was that quite often music education and community music are pitted against each other. They're often thought of two opposing sides of musical activity. So we hear this quite a lot: formal, informal, product orientated, process orientated, excellence, inclusion. And when I moved to RCM, the Royal College of Music in London in 2015, I think that was, 2015, I was asked to take a research seminar. And so I thought it'd be fun to get Lee in to do a head-to-head with myself. So we set this kind of head-to-head debate up where we went against each other to really tease out these issues of community music and music education, synergies, divergences, that kind of thing. And we had about 80 people turn up, which was fantastic, actually. And quite a lot of those people were people who wouldn't normally have gone to a research seminar at the Royal College of Music. And it made us realise that there was a much bigger conversation to be had here and a much wider audience we needed to engage. And this is where the idea of a research network project came from. So we needed something to focus our debate. We knew we wanted to get a load of people together to discuss a load of stuff, but we needed to decide what it is that we wanted to discuss. And these two concepts, excellence and inclusion, this was 2016 when we were putting together the funding application. They really were driving both community music and music education, and still are, actually. I'd done a little bit of work on the tensions between performance and teaching and found that the excellence agenda lay right at the heart of that. And everybody wants to uphold these these values of inclusion, but we know that, as we can see from the comments that you made earlier, that these things mean different things in different places to different people, but quite often we see a blanket use of the terms excellence and inclusion. So what we did is we got together a core network of 15 people, researchers, practitioners, that included ourselves. And we looked for people who were doing interesting work that intersected this music and social intersection. That's where MUSOC comes from. But who had never worked together or necessarily actually hadn't even met before. So we put together this group of people, and this made us feel quite nervous because the whole project hinged on this group working. And we didn't know if it would or not. But we know that disagreement is good. Disagreement's a good thing, and that's what we needed. And we need dissensus as much as we need consensus. And actually, Lee and I don't agree. Lee's hopefully watching the live stream, and he's probably nodding his head, or he might be shaking his head. We don't always agree, and we challenge each other, and that's very healthy, and that's how our research partnership works. So we were able to model that to this group and set up a safe space for disagreement to surface, so we could really get into the nitty-gritty of these two concepts. So our aims, what we wanted to do was to just firstly identify what these two things mean in different contexts to different people. And we had obviously musicians, community musicians, criminologists, psychologists, music therapists, community music therapists, so a whole range of different people. And then we wanted to break them down. We wanted to critique the concepts, really deconstruct them through debate and discussion. And our original idea was that we were going to rebuild a shared understanding of what these things mean and emerge from this project with shiny brand new definitions that we would put out to the world. But very early on, we realised that that wasn't our place to do that. That's actually your job to do that, not us. And what we wanted to do in the spirit of a research network project was bring people together, really get to the heart of some of these difficult issues, and then throw it out there to the research community to take forward. This is the first part of that throwing out. So I hope you will catch it and take it forward. Anyway, so to do this, we set up 3 public events, one in London, one in Aberdeen, one in York. And we had 2 bonus events. We also were able to take it to the ISME conference in Baku in 2018, and to an International Centre for Community Music, which is the centre Lee is director of up in York St John, to the Research Student Symposium there. But with these public events, what we did is we got the group together. Lee and I really posed some challenging questions. We had a whole day of discussion, and then we took the discussion to an evening debate. So we had public debates in the evening, and it was during that day the core team collaboratively designed the debate. We decided what questions would be asked, how it would be structured, etc. So it was a real collaborative venture. So that's the sort of the project, as it were. It's culminated in a special issue of the International Journal for Community MUSOC, which normally it would be coming out in June, but probably going to be July, I think, with the current state of the world. And we've written an extended editorial, and there's lots more information about the project and what it was and who was involved. I've purposely not told you because I want you to read the article, and who was involved. So you can read that there. Then we have 3 articles that have been written by members of this core team, and we gave them the task of taking the discussions from the MUSOC project, reflecting on them, bringing in their own research, and then presenting an article that can move things forward. There's a 4th article that we invited 3 doctoral students to write. So we had 2 of Lee's students, 1 of my students, who attended all the events, and so we wanted to bring their perspective in. And then the final article is Lee and I presenting the findings of the project, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. So we had 246 participants in total in our project, which is fantastic. We really didn't anticipate that. And the mentees captured lots of the discussion, and we audio recorded the closed discussion sessions as well. But I really want to make it clear that this wasn't to collect data. This was not a data collecting project. We captured the discussion so we could reflect on them, and we could see where the genesis of the ideas were. We could look at the journey the discussion took, and when we reflected on them, we found that there were 5. Here we go. There were 5 main discourses that ran through all of the events. The first one was surrounding value. The second surrounding context. The third surrounding measurement. That was quite a lively discussion. 4th on process product, and the 5th on pedagogy. And so these were all interlinked, these discourses, but they weaved their way through the discussions, and they were absolutely fraught with contradictions, and that really fascinated us. So what we did is we looked at those contradictions, and we tried to work through them and understand why they arose and how they arose. And it was doing that has led us to our findings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a taste of just one of these discourses, so you can see the kinds of things that we were discussing, and some of these contradictions that arose. And I'm going to talk about value. So value was something that came up straight away in the project. The question, who sets the standard for excellence, was one of the first questions that appeared on the mentee. If you're scrolling through, all the mentees are on the website. If you're scrolling through, you'll see them. And there were 2 distinct categories of discussion surrounding values. That to do with self, and that to do with other. So on the one hand, there was a lot of discussion about personally held values that are linked to our own self-efficacy and the values that drive us and our own values of excellence and inclusion. And then on the other hand, there was quite a vibrant critique of external bodies who are perceived to drive excellence and inclusion. So these included funders. There was a lot of critique of, about the way funders sort of, you know, what they understand excellence and inclusion to be, formal institutions, exam providers, policymakers, and these led to discussions related to power and who holds it. So whoever's setting the standard for excellence is holding the power. So this idea of power and value was there was quite a lot of discussion about this, and when we were thinking about our own the power that we have and our own values, there was a discussion about, I'll keep forgetting to, here we go, press my button. There was a discussion that as practitioners we really need to be very conscious of who we are, and we need this reflexivity to be aware of, to have our own self-awareness. But on the other hand, we've got to be really cautious not to overstate the meaning or significance of our own work and lead to a sense of arrogance. And so these two pillars of reflexivity and reflection were seen to be really important when you're working in these community music environments, when you're going in with a social agenda. And there was the understanding that this was where the macro power was to do with the external bodies who are driving the standards of excellence and deciding what we think inclusion is. But then there was this micro idea of power in our decision making. So we go into a musical context and we're making decisions, and that decisions are value judgments in themselves. So excellent and inclusive practice was considered to be practice when you passed over the decision making to other people. So there was a lot of discussion about, well, some of the things that you said at the beginning, actually, that when you give over that ability to make decisions to the people that you're working with, that constitutes really, really excellent practice, and it enables inclusivity. But there was a contradiction here, because we wanted to give those decisions over to the participants, but actually that's really hard to do. And when you're a leader, how do you do that and still lead and still maintain your role to bring that group together? It's very difficult not to impose your own voice. People are doing things and it's really hard to say, oh, it would sound much better if you just did it like that. But actually you want to try and hold back, and you've got to let the people that you're working with make their own decisions. And I've certainly seen a lot of practice that is billed as inclusive doing exactly that, actually. So the next thing that came up was to do with genre, and there was some quite heated debate about genre. So it was really clear that people thought that the values of excellence in one genre couldn't be translated over to another genre. And there were some really strongly argued views as to whether one particular genre might be inclusive or exclusive. And we got into quite some sticky debate at times. And this really contradicted any sense that excellence and inclusion are universally understood, for sure. But then what happened is we got these really weird tensions. So people who were working in a particular genre, so we had people obviously working in classical music, hip hop, folk, whatever, all sorts of different things. And they were saying, well, you can't take You can't take the values of excellence from that genre and apply it to that genre. Fine, that's okay. But my genre is universally inclusive. And we had this really, I mean, it really did boil down to, yes, it is, no, it's not, yes, it is, no, it's not. You know, there was some real argument about this. And it wasn't just one genre that was doing this. You know, there were all sorts of different people, different musicians making different sorts of music that was claiming that their genre was universally inclusive, which was quite problematic. A counterpoint to all of this was that we mustn't base our work on the single value that music is universally good. So we do see this quite a lot. You know, music is good, you do music, therefore it will heal you, it will make you better, it will do all sorts of various things. But that's quite dangerous to balance, to base our work just on that single value alone. And actually that's something that is quite heavily critiqued anyway. Then a final, I'm just going to give you a last contradiction here. This was really interesting. So quite often when people were talking about excellence, and we were talking about ourselves as musicians and performers, we want to be good. You know, I'm not doing anything that I'm not going to be brilliant at. That's for sure. You know, in our own performance, we want to reach that most highest standard of excellence we can. We value the quality of the product. But then when we move over into a different role and we become an educator or a parent or you know, a practitioner, then we value very different things. We value engagement. Look at the things that you said at the beginning about what inclusivity is and what excellence is. We value engagement. We value hard work. We value taking risks and making mistakes and learning as a result of making mistakes, and value is very much placed on the whole process. So that we found that very interesting. I'd really love to share all of this stuff with you, but I don't have time, but I also want you to read the article. So I'm going to move on and just share with you the findings. Some of these findings you will need to read the article to understand where they've come from. But we've got three main findings in total. So the first is related to pedagogy. We really believe that there's a misunderstanding of inclusive practice that's caused by focusing on the content, on what music, you know, this music or that music is inclusive, rather than the form, rather than how the music is made. And the genre debate is really clouding the issue of what inclusion is, because it isn't simple. It's really, really complex. You can't just say that this sort of music is inclusive. It doesn't work like that. Then treating excellence as a product leads to pedagogies centered on instructional strategies, and instructional strategies are quite often seen as being very exclusive because there's no participation in them. But this, it doesn't just apply to formal music making, and quite often the idea is that formal music education uses instructional strategies and is therefore exclusive. But actually this happens across the board, and I've certainly seen inclusive practice that is completely instructional. And just because you consider that your intervention is non-formal, it's not enough to claim that your intervention is inclusive. So we think that analysing pedagogy rather than the materials and content provides a better way to understand excellence inclusion. I gave a provocation at a conference a couple of years ago, challenging the transformative powers of music, and you know, we can't base our notion on that something is inclusive because of the type of music it is that we're making. We've got to really look at how people are working, and that's where we can understand both excellence and inclusion. So the second finding is related to power. There was a lot of discussion of power throughout the whole project. So I haven't really touched on this here, but we did really interrogate the notion of intervention as well, because community music practice is quite often an intervention. You go into a context and you intervene in order to initiate some kind of change. But the differences in the way interventions are used and can be understood, we can understand them through analysing the power relations, both within the intervention and also between the intervention and the wider context. And it's really important to recognise that power exists in any relationship. You know, you hear a lot about these, our music project is completely democratic, but we've got to be really careful by in saying that. And as soon as you enter into a facilitator, participant or teacher student interactions, then there are power, that power exists in those relationships. And when you offer empowering opportunities, so this passing over of the value judgments to the participant, when you offer those kind of opportunities, you really need to understand that relationships are built on inequality. So I'm the teacher and you're the student, and there's an inequality in that. But that comes with a lot of responsibility. And if you recognize that responsibility and understand the responsibility you have, then you're going to be more able to offer that empowering opportunity. And then the final finding is surrounding measurement. The need to measure impact to evidence inclusivity and excellence of funded projects is really problematic. One of the really difficult things is that when you are funded for a project, you have to identify the outcomes before you even know who you're going to be working with. And then if you measure the success of that project against the outcomes that you've set before you know who you're going to be working with, that's completely contrary to any inclusive pedagogical approaches. The first rule is you meet the person you're working with at their starting points and take them forward. But you can't do that if you don't know what their starting points are. And of course, often the most impactful outcomes are either unseen or unmeasurable. And there's a real culture of future funding being reliant on reporting positive findings, and that really clouds evaluation, and it clouds the reporting of negative findings. And that's something that community music has been really critiqued for recently. And then the measurement of impact isn't necessarily the right thing to critique, we think, and because measurement can only be fit for purpose if we actually know what we're measuring. So we think that a redefinition of the concepts of excellence and inclusion might be needed in order to ascertain what it is that we actually really want to know. And I'm coming to my punchline now. So looking through all of our discourses and looking at the things that, you know, they're completely in line with the things that you put at the beginning, we can see that actually when people talk about excellence, they talk about doing, they talk about what they're doing. And when people talk about inclusion, they talk about this is the aim, this is what we want to be. And quite often excellence is thought of as a product, you know, that sort of contradiction between ourselves. Our product is excellent, and inclusion is thought about as a process. But we say, what would happen if we flipped those definitions around? What would happen if we thought about excellence as a process? And then what would happen if we thought about inclusion as the product of that process? So this is our call to action. This is our throwing it out there to the research community to take forward. So we challenge you, practitioners, the research community, to really think about this, to think about this reversal of these two concepts, and think about what that would look like in your practice. We've put a few kind of questions at the end of our article, but this is where the research network begins, and so hopefully this is the opening up of the conversation, and we really want people to think about this and take hold of it and critique it, challenge it, but see what would be different if we thought about excellence being the process and inclusion being the product.
Jenny, thank you so much. Is that the end of your presentation?
That is the end of my, sorry. I can't see anybody on my screen, so I've got no idea if everybody's gone and had a cup of tea.
No, we're all here, absolutely all here. In fact, you've got more people than when you started out. First of all, just want, before we open to questions, to say just how thought-provoking this is, and actually the punchline that you had at the end with the questions attached to it raises some really interesting things that we could perhaps look at. I wonder when, at some point, if people want to have a 2-second break before we start the questions, or are you happy to start? Does anybody need a quick comfort break? Any thoughts? Jenny, what do you think? Are you happy just to go straight through?
Don't mind, you can go straight through. I've put a mentee slide here, so people can actually, because I was quite aware that, because we're talking about inclusion, I was quite aware that last week people were using the chat to comment, but if anybody's watching via the YouTube link, they won't be able to see that discussion. So I'd encourage you to use the mentee here.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll do a bit of both. You want to? We'll start with the one that's just gone up on Mentee, and I've got two people who want to ask questions on Zoom.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I've had to really reconcile the context that I work in. And before I went into conservatoires, I worked at the Institute of Education, which is a sort of equivalent institution to a conservatoire for education. And I really had to reconcile this idea of excellence with my own beliefs about inclusion. But I think it's being a hotbed for misuse of these terms. I don't know whether it's a misuse or whether it's necessarily just everybody having a different interpretation of what they mean. I mean, we've been looking at our strategic plan this year, and we've been asking people, you know, what the qualities of an RNCM graduate is, and this word excellence was used quite a lot, but it was used in a lot of different contexts. And I think probably what we need to do is we need to make our definitions more visible. We need to really think ourselves what that means, and I think there's a lot of assumptions about what we mean when we talk about excellence, and I think inclusion is also quite you know, a difficult term within a conservatoire environment. There's I think some of the work that conservatoires need to do is break down some of the urban myths about what we actually do. I mean, you know, before I entered one to work in one, I had all sorts of assumptions of what would be happening and how teaching was taking place and all kinds of things. And, you know, I was surprised. I think conservatoires are very different places to what they were like 20, 30 years ago. But a lot of teachers who work outside of conservatoires, who went through the conservatoire system 30 years ago, still hold that view of what they're like. And I think we need to do a lot of work to break down some of those urban myths. There's a million questions coming up.
Can I get one from Ask David Horn to ask the next question? There are lots that are going up on here though, of course. David,
yes. Thank you very much, Jenny. I really, really enjoyed the presentation, and there was a lot of material there that, you know, got me thinking, and it was provocative in a really good way. One that I particularly resonated with, but I realized I'd never thought about it before, is I do a lot of work for organizations going into schools, and always when I go in, I'm presented as a musician or a composer, and I will go in with performers, and, you know, this is a flute player, that's a violin player, and that happens at all levels. And I can understand it a little bit when it comes to kind of specialist support for A-level, etc. But I think it is really problematic, actually. And I think the more that I reflect on what you were saying about that, I'm sure it's really problematic in inclusion. In other words, if I come in and I'm called a composer, and then they look on the chart on the wall, and other composers are like Bach and Beethoven, and they're all dead, and they're all white, and they're all male. And of course, I'm representative of that particular group as well.
We're not dead.
I'm not dead yet. We'll all be dead at one. But yeah, it seems. I'm just wondering what you think people like me and the organisations I work for can do to. I think it's also the teachers. They see us in these categories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is really, really pertinent, David, and I can tell you now the excellence agenda is stifling school music making in primary schools, absolutely stifling it. And I saw this very clearly when I worked at the Institute of Education, and I worked with primary generalist teachers, and I've done some research looking at the issue of music teaching in primary schools. And the problem is, you know, I've always gone into a school classroom as the music lady. You know, I'll be the music lady for the rest of my life, I think, you know. And as soon as you do that, as you know, in a primary school, the purpose of a generalist teacher is so every child can see that they can access every single subject. They have one teacher for every single subject. You bring in a musician, then all of a sudden my teacher isn't a musician. That means I'm not a musician. You know, there's a whole load of problems with this, and particularly when you go into a school context as an expert, and there's some of the research that I've done looking at the musical starting points of primary generalist teachers reveals that actually they're very, very musical people. You know, they've got grades up to their eyeballs, and they've got A-level music and all sorts of things. But we have this weirdness in music that as soon as you meet somebody who is just a bit better than you, you think you're rubbish. You know, it's really strange. And I think that there's a lot of work that we need to do to think about how we present ourselves and what a musician is. And you know, you do a lot of work, David, working with children to get them to see themselves as musicians. And you know, there isn't a quick answer as such, but I do think that certainly in primary schools, really addressing the point that primary teachers can't teach music. You know, they're musical adults who can explore music as much as the kids can, and involving the teachers. The teachers see the kids, they're their role models. They see the kids being a musician too. It's really difficult when you know, I've done it, I've gone into a context and I've been, you know, here's the musician, and I've just kind of like thought, oh God, I'm gonna have to spend about 10 minutes undoing that, you know. But I guess it's how we present ourselves that is really key.
Great, thank you. Do you want to take one of the questions that's on mentee?
Yeah, I can see Kirsten from Scotland is there. Hi, Kirsten. She was involved in the research network. So great that the YouTube is working. Oh, inclusion as a product. Right. So there's a question there that says, can you clarify what inclusion as a product means? So yeah, that's a tricky one. So when I haven't got all my notes in front of me, but when people were discussing the notion of inclusion, it was an ideal. We had this really problematic debate about, actually, if you want to be inclusive, you've got to be exclusive. And this idea of the exclusivity of inclusive practice was really difficult. So, you know, you want to target a particular group of people, that means that you're naturally excluding, you know, others. And so there was a sort of thread of discussion that went along the lines that, well, the way, there's the trombone lesson starting. The way to reconcile this is to think about inclusion as the ideal state. So that's the ideal that you want to achieve. So, you know, we then started to think, well, is that then the product? You know, that inclusion is the product of that's what we want to achieve.
Wonderful. I think we've got a question. Jane Ginsburg had her hand up. Jane?
I did, but my question was really, it was a very general question. I wanted to know what was surprising that came out of the, I wanted to know Jennie, was there anything that surprised you, or what surprised you that came out of this project?
You'll have to read the article, Jane. No, I'm joking.
The York St. John repository, but it doesn't seem to be in ours yet. so I can't.
No, what we're doing, actually, I should have mentioned this. What we did is we used some of the project funding to pre-order a whole load of hard copies of the journal so we could distribute it. But obviously, in where we are at the moment, we're not going to be able to distribute the hard copies. So we're negotiating with the publisher to use that money that we've paid for it to be open access. So everybody can read it.
So the journal isn't available online?
Well, it's not out yet.
Right.
So
well,
it can, yes.
Right, okay. Yes.
Anyway, what surprised me, so, well, it surprised me that it worked, actually, because we purposefully set up quite a antagonistic environment. So we purposefully got people together that we knew would disagree, and the network team really, you know, we were very nervous about that first meeting, and it took a little bit of time to warm up, but they were really on board with it, and they you know, the project, it developed, and it really took a life on its own through. I was really surprised when there were people saying, oh, my music is inclusive, everybody can make my music, everybody can be included in my music. And it surprised me the lack of self-awareness that showed, because people might not like that music, you know. So it's like, that's a real basic, you know, principle. So I found that very surprising. I found that one of the real difficulties about the project was that we were trying to capture as many voices as we possibly could. And the whole researcher practitioner thing is quite difficult. And so what we did with the last event is we had that as a sort of one-day conference where we invited practitioners, and we used a lot of the project funding to get people there and to pay for people's travel to be able to come. And that was fantastic. I mean, the way the practitioners and the researchers, and actually within community music, you tend to be both anyway. The way everybody worked with each other was really fantastic. So yeah, quite a lot of things, I guess.
Thank you very much indeed for that.
We have lots of questions that keep going past very quickly on the screen, but there's one that asks you about to give an example of a genre that claims to be all-inclusive.
I'm not going to do that, actually, because the people who were involved in those debates know who they are, and what I really don't want to do is single people out. So I wouldn't really want to do that in a public environment. That's part of my ethics, I'm afraid.
So the next question here, it keeps jumping past, but do you want to select a question from the 17 that we have?
Yeah, I can pause them if you want. Shall I pause for a little? Oh, press enter. Where's enter?
I tried to do that, but it didn't work.
I know it's me, I have to press enter. Yeah. Let's have a little look. Oh yes, there's right. The one in the middle here, is funding not a hugely influential issue here? Yes, absolutely. The debate about funding ran throughout the whole project, you know, and we tried to engage funders in the debate, and there was, because what we also did is we had Twitter debates as well, so people who were not in the room could participate in the debates. We live streamed stuff and people could engage over Twitter, but it boiled down to argument, you know, and we wanted to move beyond argument. There is a real problem with the need to set criteria for funding, but then, you know, the way that you have to measure everything. I mean, the measurement thing is really hard, because we're being forced to use sort of research methods to measure stuff that aren't appropriate. They're not the right tools for the job, because you know, I've worked in prisons, for example, and there are very particular issues surrounding work there, but you know, the impacts that you see are very, very difficult to measure in the way that a funder wants you to measure them. So that's quite problematic. There is I'm working on a research proposal at the moment, actually, that's come out of the this project. So it's a collaboration with some of the researchers and practitioners that engaged. And I don't really want to give too much away about that at the moment because it's in development. But the idea is that we would work with funders to develop benchmark criteria for various things. I'm going to not say anything more about that at the moment because the proposal's not really finished.
That whole issue about funding and your outcome, stating your outcomes, but also they show giving positive results is a very important one, and that we're all of us struggle with in our areas, because that isn't always appropriate. I think Manus Carey wants to ask a question. Manus?
Hello, Jenny.
Hi, Manus.
First, thanks so much. This is absolutely fascinating, and I think this is the central issue in a way that we should be discussing at Conservatorize, and it's obviously central to our strategy and everything. Can I just make one very quick point? And I have two very quick questions I'd love to ask. One was in one of our lab projects. It was very interesting, and to pick up on something you were saying about process and product. We're trying to focus a lot more on process, and actually our students by and large found that very, very difficult. They wanted to click into product initially, and I think even when you get to the age of 18 working this level, almost it's too late, I think, to be exploring some of these things. Two very quick questions. One was, so your provocation at the end, which I think is absolutely brilliant. You obviously we're very much talking about excellence and inclusion as almost polar opposites. And I'm wondering, did you talk about the ability to be able to see them as the same thing at all? Is that possible, or part of two sides of the same coin, or that? And then the other question I just wanted to ask was, when we talk about inclusion and sort of going to participants or students on their own terms, when we live in such a multicultural country, this is something I wrestle with in my head. What's your views on where classical fits then? Because if we're trying not to, if we want to go to participants on their own terms and not sort of foist on them a genre or a tradition that maybe don't know who that is. It's not me. Did you get that question? I don't know if it...
I did get that question, yes. And I'm also just laughing at David Horn, who has just put an image of himself so he can walk away without us knowing. I don't know if everybody else can see that. Anyway, sorry, David. Yeah, right. Really interesting, Manus. I think the process products thing and also the excellence inclusion thing, one of the real problems are these false dichotomies that we create. And again, you know, I've done this purposefully, set them up as being two kind of things, but actually we need both process and product. I mean, you know, people are not stupid. They know if their product is not good, you know, and you need to have that feeling of accomplishment on reflecting on what it is that you've produced, as much as you need to really focus on the process. And actually a product is a process in itself. So, you know, when you start to think about what a performance is actually a process. So, you know, you can get quite granular when you start unpicking all of that. But this excellent, there was a lot of talk. One of the first things that we, after the first event, we the core network people put a statement up, and they're all on those on the website, and I went through and I looked at those, and you know, people were really clear that actually these are the same thing. Of course we can have excellent inclusive process, you know, they're very different things. They're not sides of, you know, they're not opposite each other. It's not a dichotomy, but they, you know, they do coexist, and actually you're right, they could mean the same thing. Again, if I went back to the descriptions of what people think inclusion is and what people think excellence is, they're very, very similar. The definitions are very similar. And I can't remember what your last question was. It was about classical music, wasn't it? Well, that's the problem. This is exactly the problem. We've got to stop thinking about genres, because I mean, what even is classical music? You look at what our our students do. I mean, you know, I don't know the students here as well as I knew the students at RCM, but of course, you know, they're doing all kinds of things. They're, you know, they're playing in an orchestra, and then they're going off and they're doing a wedding gig, and then they've got a little jazz combo somewhere, and then they're doing a bit of, you know, they're in a rock band. They're doing all kinds of things. And I think meeting people at their starting points doesn't necessarily mean meeting them with their music. And actually that ties in with research that was done probably about 20 years ago about music in the classroom, and you know, the whole informal music movement. As soon as you start bringing the kids' own music into the classroom, it's seen as school music, and then they're, you know, they're going to disengage. So I think it's the real, I think that's the wrong question to ask. The real question to ask is, how do we find out what their starting points are, and then how can we meet them?
I think that there are a number of questions that relate to genre here on the mentee, and really interesting, sort of encouraging you to challenge those divisions, and actually a younger generation often doesn't experience them in the same way. Do you want to choose another question from the list on mentee?
Let's have a look. Do you know, I've got I don't know how to move this bit so I can see the ones on the other side. Let's have a little look. How do we refocus our outcomes? What is that going to say? Oh, how do we refocus our outcomes to see excellence as the process and inclusion as the product? What are the measurable points we can look for? Well, that's not for us to say, really. that's what we, you know, when we started this project, that's what we thought we might do, but then we decided that that wasn't for us to say. And that's, you know, this research forum is research in process, and that is the next thing that we need to do. We need you to have a look at all of your practice and see how you do that. Measurable points is difficult because we, you know, we're really tied by this idea of measurement, because we do need it. You know, we had this discussion came through very strongly. You know, we've got to prove that what we're doing. In one of the debates, we asked, you know, how do I know if quality is contingent, how do I know what I'm doing is any good? Because we need to know for ourselves that what we're doing is good. So we need a way to measure and evaluate things. But when we're absolutely locked in, you know, we do things just for the sake of measuring, that's really difficult. So I guess that question, I'm going to throw that back to the person who asked it and say that that's for you to answer, and tell me in 6 months' time when you've come up with a solution.
What about, let's see, do you want to choose another one? Because we've got no hands up on the Zoom, but you've got 19 questions on here. So take another one where we've not already perhaps tackled the issue.
Yeah, there was a question just there about what Manna said about 18 perhaps being a little bit too late. Here we go. Post-education is too late to ask for a total mind change in how you learn, how learning is directed. Probably needs to start with under 18 music. Yeah, you know, a lot of community music activity is aimed at kids who are disaffected by traditional formal music education. And so within this field of community music, that's actually, you know, where it started. I mean, it has been for years. And actually there's you know, the problem really lies in our formal education system, and the way that we you know, the way that we go through, and our kids, they go through this exam and that exam and that exam and that exam, and everything is related to these points that we can measure where somebody's ability and standard is, and it's all about the product of what they do. If you think about how we audition for some of the, I'm being really careful not to name names, but some of the kind of like, say, national orchestras and stuff that are aimed at children, then, you know, you audition in age banded groups. So you audition for an under 10 group or an under 11 group. So that's fine if you started to play your instrument at 6, but what if you were 10 when you started to play and you've not reached that gold standard point? You don't have the product, you haven't got the certificate to say that's the standard that you're at. You've been written off by the time you're 11, you know, because you started a year later than everybody else. It's really problematic. I've said this at conferences before, that the structures that are in place, that, to be fair, are structures that have been in place for a long time. Actually, it's very, very difficult. So, you know, you want to include everybody, but you've got this real conundrum that they've got to be able to participate, because there's no point having people in who can't participate, because then that's exclusive in itself. But then, so how do you know, include people without, you know, valuing what they can do? It's very, very difficult. I mean, my real passion is primary music, as you know. That's, you know, I've worked with primary teachers, and I really think it really worries me about the way we view primary music. You know, primary music is not about playing an instrument. It's about exploring music and discovering music. It's about engaging with sound and putting sounds together and finding out what you can do with those sounds. And then it's about manipulating things and making musical choices. You know, these are the core skills of primary music that are being shifted out. And it's partly because, you know, the schools, there's no time for music. We know all of that. But it's also partly because we have this excellence agenda. What's excellence? Well, excellence is playing on that stage and playing a million notes. And, you know, so the teachers in schools see that and think, oh gosh, well, I can't do that, and how am I going to get my kids to do that? And the whole point of that first important learning about music and how it works and how we engage with it and how it makes us feel and what it makes us do is just kind of missed, because we need to be able to assess whether they know what a treble clef is, you know. So really, I think as a conservatoire, what we should be doing is we should be really campaigning for primary music to become primary music, and we should be really investing in helping teachers to understand what primary music is, because that's the main problem. I think a lot of people don't really understand what music as a subject is.
I think certainly in primary, the pressure on the curriculum has led to music being marginalised both at primary and secondary. So there's a huge national crisis, I guess, if we do want to encourage the next generation of people and to give access to people to have that opportunity to reach whatever standards that are deemed to be necessary. Amanda Babington has raised her hand. Amanda.
Hello. Speaking of under 18s, I might be interrupted by my daughter, who's got a pile of books to work through, but I can get my question in before she raises her voice. What about the role of music making outside of schools? Because I found that for me was really key, and I was very lucky to grow up with an amazing sort of array of musical opportunities that in a lot of ways compensated for the fact that neither of my primary or secondary schools had a great deal of music. And like, as you were outlining then, I came late to instruments like violin, much later than a lot of my peers who I then ended up with in tertiary education.
I'm being distracted by my son's trombone. Sorry, Amanda. So what was the question about music making outside of the school?
Yes, and what part you felt that played in this development of particularly under 18s and their attitude to the idea of excellence as process?
Yeah, you know, I think what's really interesting, you know, children, they do all sorts of things. They, you know, they do their school music and they do music outside of school, and they're, you know, they have teachers who are really highly influential. So quite often it's about a personality. I mean, when I've looked at community music projects, and actually this comes through a lot, well, probably all of the research that I've done, every single study, that relationship between the teacher, student, band director, you know, trumpeter, facilitator, participant, that's the absolute key thing. And you know, so for you, that music making outside school was really important to your development. There are other kids where, and this is where we have to be careful, because I used to I worked at a Saturday morning music centre for a long time, you know, and for some kids, they didn't want to be there. It was babysitting, you know, it was their parents went shopping and they went to the music centre, and it wasn't for them, and it really wasn't doing it for them. But we quite, you know, we're there going, oh, everybody loves it, it's great, everybody's here and amazing. And sometimes you've got to break that down a little bit. But I think the point is that every different role I've had, so when I've been a class teacher, or when I've been a flute teacher, or when I've been an orchestra director, or running a summer course, every different role I've had, you feel that that's the most important part of the child's music making. But in reality, it is only a part of it. And this was part of the thing about not overstating the significance and importance of what we do, because as soon as you start to overstate that significance, importance, then you can kind of create a barrier. You know, as soon as you put pressure on the kids, oh, you have to come, you've got to come, because this is, you know, it's great, it's social, it's a brilliant experience. And then you start to create you know, a bit of anxiety on the part of the child. Well, what if I can't go? What if I can't participate? What if I can't do it? And it's about how you set those things up. So my doctoral research actually looked at adult, I used to run a adult ensemble, adult learning ensemble, and one of the really crucial things about the difference between an amateur group that is there to come and play and go away again, and an amateur group that is there for learning, was actually how you set that up, and the etiquette that you create within the you know, the context. And it won't be for everybody, but if you set it up as an environment where people, you know, if you can't practice, if you haven't got a chance to practice, then that's okay. You know, I've seen, we've all seen it, haven't we, sort of conductors of youth orchestras yelling at kids because they've not practiced, and you think, oh my god, this kid has 3 hours of homework a night to do, and they've got gym, and they've got football, and they've got ballet, and they've got everything else, you know. So when the conductor sort of rethinks their role and what they're doing and how they're talking to the people that they're working with, again, this is this power relationship, then it becomes something more conducive. So I'm going well off the point here, but the you know, the out of school experience, of course, they're really important, but again, we've got to be really careful that we don't just have one single idea of what is important and what aids children's development, because it's a whole range. You know, you ask any of our students, and I can guarantee you they have a whole range of different things that they've engaged with, and they've had the opportunity to engage in those things, and that's what has developed them into the musicians that they are.
A very, very interesting response. We're having there's a few new questions that are coming through on Mentee. So do you want to unpause your scroll so you can, so you can see them?
That was an interesting question that went through as part of did you purposefully include people who are usually excluded? So that's did we purposefully target people? What we did with the core research network team, because we thought quite long and hard actually about the people who we would invite to be part of that network team, and we could have chosen, you know, 15 people from hundreds of people, but what we wanted to do is we wanted to include people who were not necessarily the strongest voices that are heard. We had some people, you know, who were incredibly experienced and really well published and really well regarded, and that was important, but we also had people who were quite at the start of their research careers. We had practitioners in there as well, who normally wouldn't have this kind of platform. So that actually was quite an important part of how we put that group together. You know, we didn't want it to be just the normal normal people that you would hear from. With the public events, obviously it was, I mean, they were just open, they were open to anybody, and we used our networks, you know, to advertise them and get people involved and included. But when we did the so what we did for the final event, it was called a knowledge exchange forum, but that was just before knowledge exchange became understood to be about making money, you know. So it was a knowledge exchange forum that was about sharing and exchanging knowledge. And we decided, and actually I think this annoyed a few people, and a few people stayed away because of this, but we decided that we weren't going to have any keynotes. We didn't want keynote speeches, because as soon as you have a keynote speech, you set up an environment where somebody holds all of the knowledge and power and is giving that knowledge across, a bit like I'm doing now, really, giving all of that knowledge, you know, across to everybody else. So what we did is we put out a call for participation. And there were some people who didn't quite understand the point behind this and quite understand what we were doing here. But what it did is it engaged different people that you wouldn't normally have speaking at a conference. And we used these fishbowl discussion techniques to have rather than do keynotes. What we did is we set up fishbowls where there's 3 people that start off the discussion, and it's done in a circle, and then anybody can jump in and sit in the chair and move around and keep the discussion very fluid and flowing. And we used lightning talks, so we had like a speaker's corner, and people had 2 minutes to give a talk, and we had a digital hangout. This is pre-COVID, where people submitted a video, who couldn't be there in person submitted a video, and then we hooked them up on Skype, and people wandered around computers and watched these little videos and spoke to the person who they wanted to speak to. So we really built into the project were mechanisms and methods to engage people that we wouldn't normally have heard from. Whether we succeeded in that, I think that we did succeed in that to a certain extent. I think you're always going to you know, there's always going to be reasons why people can't participate, and the feedback we got after that knowledge exchange forum was that the techniques that we used were really refreshing, and people felt that they really were able to have their voice heard and put their point across and contribute in a way that they really wouldn't have been able to do had it been quite a sort of formal conference environment.
Thank you for that. There's a question that keeps floating past on the screen around the role of critical pedagogy.
Oh, there
I
it is.
wondered whether you want to ask that one. It's in the middle column.
Yeah, so critical pedagogy, this is so if you're not familiar with critical pedagogy, this has its roots in Frere, so Frere in pedagogy, I can never pronounce his name correctly. In Pedagogy, the press talks about well, critiques what he calls banking education. So this idea that you hold the knowledge and you pass on the knowledge to other people, and that's how we transmit a knowledge, and that is a way of control and power, and it's a way for the authority to control the people, and that really, if we really want to educate and emancipate, then we need to adapt an approach that he called problem posing education. So this is where that relationship of teacher student is broken down, and you set a problem, and you work together to solve the problem, and you learn as a teacher. So you know, this of course you look at socio-cultural learning theory, and it's exactly the same thing, and there's lots of different theoretical perspectives, but critical pedagogy is something that's quite embedded within community music. The thing that I would say about this is, one of the real problems in music education, we've of course, music education is going through quite a critical time at the moment, has been for the past few years, and there's been quite a bit of a rush to be the person that finds the solution. You know, everybody wants to find this one size fits all fix. You know, I want to be the one to create the great pedagogy that's going to save music education, and it's really problematic. And I think critical pedagogy, if you know, is a real way to focus on you know, on the process and product together. And if you think about what Manus was talking about with the lab days, I think he might have gone with the lab days with our students, actually that, you know, that's a critical pedagogical approach. But of course, one pedagogy doesn't suit all. And one of the things that we often forget, well, this, you know, this was a bit of an awakening for me as well. But of course, you know, when you work with people from all sorts of different countries, they've got all kinds of different pedagogical backgrounds, and actually expecting somebody who has never had to give their own opinion or discuss or debate in the way that we expect, you know, our students to engage in critical discussion is exclusive in itself. And this is what I mean by meeting people at their starting points. You know, you've got to acknowledge, you know, you can't go in like a bulldozer and just suddenly go, right, this is how we're going to do it, like it or lump it. You know, you've got to think really carefully, and it boils down to this self-awareness. You know, this idea of self-awareness goes throughout all of this, that you've got to be really aware of who you are, where you're coming from, what your values are, but then how that translates to other people, and how you're enabling other people to you know, hold on to their values as well.
Thank you very much for that. I'm thinking also that there are national debates around this, and you're very much part of them, and in addressing a lot of these questions. But it's also something that perhaps within our conservatoire contexts, and there are probably others listening from other conservatoires here, that we need to look at the role potentially of the conservatoire in addressing many of these questions. And I wondered whether perhaps some discussion at the staff conference in the early part of the academic year could be a good way of bringing people together who have different sort of responsibilities and different thoughts around how we work with young people on young projects, or Fiona's engagement activities, and we address some of these questions around excellence and inclusivity in that way. And it's just a thought.
Yeah, when I was at RCM, myself and my colleague Vibeke Tormalensen, sorry Vibeke if you're listening, I've pronounced that wrong, but we set up a debate, and this came off the back of the MUSOC project, but Vibeke was also working in some very, very similar areas. She's a musicologist, and we set up a study day at RCM called "Can the Conservatoire Justify its Place in 21st Century Music Education?" And we wanted to be provocative, and we really wanted to raise some of these issues and address the role that the Conservatoire plays in this, because to be frank, Conservatoire's got a real bashing in this project, and my colleague at RCM, Rosie Perkins, was involved in the research network as well, and we were in quite a difficult position sometimes, because there's this perception that we set the standards and we hold the power, and etc. So we set up this discussion at RCM, and it was really interesting, and we took that forward to the RMA music HE, sorry Michelle, I can't remember the new name, conference on equality, diversity, inclusion, and it needs to be done. I've got plans to submit a symposium for the next RIME Research in Music Education conference and invite colleagues to debate just this. So I think, at a national level, there's things that we need to be doing to really, and we need to start with this. We've got to start with the debate and the discussion, and we've got to get the issues out and up to the surface before we can begin to address them. Internally, the Learning and Teaching Conference, that I need to think about how that's going to work, but our annual Learning and Teaching Conference in June, I'd set the theme as redesigning inclusive learning. So internally, that was very much about, how we design inclusive learning within our environment. So.
Great, thank you. It's just seems that we need to take these debates and discussions forward, and hopefully it'd be great to see, great to read your article as well, and see the repercussions and the impact of that. Before we thank Jennie, just to draw your attention, everyone, that we have next week, Adam Swain is going to be taking the stage to give our next online research forum. So please come and listen to him. He is our new Deputy Head of School of Keyboard Studies. And he's going to be talking about his 19th century research. He's a performer and musicologist, so juggles all of these. So please be there for that. And then we also have the Postgraduate Research Students Conference is taking place next Monday and Tuesday. It is going to be live streamed. It is be running all day, and we will advertise the program for that. But please do pop in and listen to the huge array of research topics that our doctoral students are doing at the RNCM. We have Mark Heron on the 27th of May, John Miller on the 3rd of June, and we have a session on the 17th of June that is looking at research around COVID-19 and our responses to that. We'll come in and out of this particular topic. Obviously, we dealt with it with David Horn's talk last week, and we'll be looking at it again with Sam Duffy doing a substantial presentation at that event on the 17th of June. So please put these dates in your diary, and it's brilliant to see new faces at the research forum, and it's nice that actually that it's perhaps more possible to take part in it, and it's brilliant that we can also open it up to colleagues and friends outside of our institution, because that's vital. So Jennie, thank you for a fantastic talk, really thought-provoking and very pertinent to both the national level, but also those of us who are working at a conservatoire. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
See you all next week. Bye-bye.